Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
Hi, I'm Duane Tollefson. I've made my living in the construction industry since 1977 and as a carpenter and went back to tech school and learned the trade and sometime in '94 I was working on a daycare center in Cass Lake and my uncle died. And my cousins called me up and asked me if I'd design his casket. And that had never entered my mind to design a casket or to even build a casket. So I called the local funeral home and I said, what's the law? Because I had no idea. I figured you die, you go to the funeral home. And he said, well, there's no law, but some cemeteries require a vault, and to fit in a vault, it has to be less than 30 inches wide and less than 6'6" long. A strong bottom, strong handles, and some kind of a lid. And outside of that, it's your funeral, and we're here to provide the service. A couple days later, in October, I got a letter from Mrs. Severson. And it reads as follows. I just wanted to let you know we were very pleased, and she's underlined very pleased, with the casket we purchased for you. I have had several people ask about it and seem interested in using that kind of a casket. I guess the problem we have is having a suitable place to store them. I myself will definitely want one, and I'm wondering if I purchase one, would you be able to store it? I want to be buried within 24 to 48 hours as my husband was, and I know that's not very much time to construct one. I'm 69 years old and in fairly good health, but life is uncertain, and I do not want this to be a burden for my family. I would appreciate hearing from you. Yours very truly. So I got a hold of her, and she ordered a coffin, and of course I said I can store it, and I did. But then I got a letter from her in November. Now she paid $450 for the coffin. This letter came November 6th of 2000. It says, Dear Sir, my husband, whom you made the coffin for, was a veteran. The VA have a policy in which they will pay $450 for burial expenses for each veteran. I submitted the receipt which you provided, but they would not accept that because they said it was paid for by Mark and Betty Severson because I was down in Minneapolis at the hospital with Edvin. I asked Mark and Betty to do this for me, so they ordered, picked up, and paid for it initially. It was my expense. The VA suggested I ask for a new receipt using my name instead of Mark and Betty. They also needed the name of the person for whom it was provided on the receipt. That would be Edvin R. Severson. I do not remember the exact date of the original receipt, but Edvin passed away on the 26th of July. I would also appreciate getting your phone number. So by November, I have her coffin in storage. And I sent her a receipt, so I just met her this summer. Sweetest woman that you could want. And I'm going to tell you her story of her coffin, because I built her coffin in 2000. Now, she told me when I met her recently that they didn't use a funeral home. When Edvin died, they put him in the coffin, put him in the ground, and they took him to the burial site in his old Dodge pickup. Well, I had Mrs. Severson's coffin in storage, and time passed, and in December of 2004, a fellow from Bagley died, and his wife called me and said, I need a coffin tomorrow. Well, I didn't have time to build a coffin tomorrow, but I had Mrs. Severson's in storage, and Mrs. Severson is in relatively good health. This fellow is not. So I said, I can build it, I can rebuild it. So I sold Mrs. Severson's coffin to this fellow and this family, and between December of 2004 and January of 2005, I got it rebuilt. Mrs. Severson's number 2 was back in storage. January 29th of 2005, I had a heart attack. So I spent most of 2005 on my deathbed. March of 2005, my sister's father-in-law died, and they wanted a pine box. And I didn't have time to build one. I could come out here and spend 15 minutes and have to go lay down. But I had Mrs. Severson's coffin in storage, and I was broke. Mrs. Severson is in relatively good health. This fella needs a coffin, and I need some money. I figured I can build it, I can do it. So I sold Mrs. Severson number 2 to my sister's father-in-law family, and it took me 6 months to get Mrs. Severson's coffin number 3 rebuilt. But I got it rebuilt and put in storage. Then in January of 2006, I get a call from the son of the fellow that's in Mrs. Severson number 1. He said, we need a coffin for Mom. I said, what's wrong with Mom? He said, well, they've given her 6 months to live. And I said, what could ail your mother that they would give her an expiration date? And he said, she's diabetic with a heart condition. I said, do you mean that's fatal? Well, it seems like it. Well, so I had 6 months to build her coffin. Well, in the middle of this 6-month period, now over the years, I don't build them all, but I built a few. And I built a coffin for a fella whose wife was still alive, and And she had heard that it was illegal for me to build coffins. So she never ordered one. Well, she died. And the family needed a coffin. In that one picture I showed you where there's the coffins lined up on the bench, and I have Mrs. Severson, number 3. Well, she died, they need a coffin. And Mrs. Severson is in relatively good health. So I sold Mrs. Severson, number 3, to this other family. And I effectually and fervently pray for Mrs. Severson's continued good health. So I tell people, if you want to live forever, I'll store your coffin and I'll pray for you and keep you in good health. In the process of time, I sold her 3rd coffin, or her coffin for the 3rd time. I finally got it rebuilt and in storage. And February of this year, February of 2011, a family from Clearbrook, they lost their man, and the family came, and that was the only coffin I had. And they needed it right away, and I told them the story of Mrs. Severson's coffin and how I pray for her continued good health, and that I've sold this coffin 4 times, or 3 times, 3 times. And they decided they wanted it. And Mrs. Severson is in relatively good health. Now, even though it's been 10 years, I'm going to assume, and I had never talked to her, except for our correspondence back in 2000. And I've also prayed that she has a good sense of humor. So I sold Mrs. Severson, number 4, to this family, and here's the letter I got from them. This is a thank you note they sent to me, and it says, Duane, we would like to thank you for selling us the Mrs. Severson model coffin for Charlie. We were very satisfied with it, thank you. So we're calling Mrs. Severson's coffin our best-selling model. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting her this summer, and she has a wonderful sense of humor. She just cackled when I told her the story. I called her up and asked her if I could share this on this program. She said, oh, yes, absolutely. And she said, what are you going to do when I die? I said, we're going to have to discontinue your model. Unless I hire help to come in, well, and I sell them for $5.50, and I don't make a lot of money at that. And like I said, I don't make a living at this. It's what they did 100 years ago. The local carpenters and cabinet builders built the coffins. People would store them in the barn or in the attic. The first This Old House episode that I ever watched was a 3-story mansion in Massachusetts, and at the top of every stairway there was this little alcove, and they said that was to get the coffins out of the attic, because they used to store the coffins in the attic, and so that's where.
So are you, in a sense, would you say you're kind of preserving history?
I'm trying to create a renaissance, and let's redo this. Let's rethink what they used to do, and like we spoke earlier, funerals cost a lot of money because people pay it. They don't have to if you think ahead, if you plan ahead, and this is one small way to make it, and it doesn't have to be. One issue with wooden coffins is they stay in the ground. In '94, when the Mississippi River flooded, they had all these caskets coming up, and it was the vaults that were popping up, just because their concrete doesn't hold them in the ground. We've got boulders that have been coming up for centuries, and frost pushes them up. This stays in the ground. You put it in the ground, it stays there. But what I would hope is that and there are getting to be more and more people that have bought them and stored them. A couple of things that are really cool, that really make it personal, is that there was a fellow from Solway who died in, his wife called me about the 3rd week in May, and hospice was taking care of him, and she picked up the coffin on the 20th of May. He died the 21st. He wasn't embalmed. They had him, at the funeral, they took him to the cemetery on a buckboard with a team of his horses. That's a homemade thing. I mean, another family, the fellow was in a nursing home, and they bought the coffin, and he was a mechanic all his life, and they took him from the funeral on the back of his '29 Chevy that he had restored, and they drove past his house for one last trip and took him to the cemetery. And that just it makes it personal. It's so real. And, that's where I would like to get. I'd like to see people take a more personal approach, because death is an important part of life. And like we said, everybody dies. I don't know anybody that was alive in the 1800s, and that's only 100 years, or 110. So that would be my my conclusion, is that and it doesn't have to be my coffins. It can be, like for instance, there was a fellow that just passed away Saturday. He was in his late 80s. He had a tree that blew down in his yard, and he had a local carpenter build his casket, and he had it in storage, and he's in it now. The funeral's tomorrow. So, you know, I'm not the only one that does this. There's, and like I said, 100 years ago, that was part of the carpenter's job, was to build coffins, and it wasn't uncommon. And then, of course, the industry took over, and it became industrial and impersonal. Whereas this is personal. In getting to know the people, you're meeting them in general at the most vulnerable time in their life. They're at the lowest that they can be, as far as when you're trying to deal with getting your head around someone losing a loved one is a process. Grief is a process, and so that most of the people that are in the coffins or that I've sold to are people that I know. There's getting to be more and more people that I don't. But it also, you get in touch with them at a very low point in their life, and maybe you can help them out a little bit. Maybe you can lift them up. And in some of the thank you cards I've gotten, they confirm that. I mean, this is exactly what we wanted. You meet people at a very hard time in their life. Now, I guess to summarize, this is a process that I had never considered, but got into it, and in getting into it, I get educated of the process of how industrial it has become, the whole process of death. This opens up an alternative that has always existed, but now, maybe we're a little closer to where we need to be as a society, in taking personal attention to our living and our dead.
If you enjoyed this segment of Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground, consider making a contribution at lptv.org. If you have segment ideas pertaining to North Central Minnesota, contact us at legacy@lptv.org. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund by the vote of the people on November 4th, 2008.